Esteemed colleagues, it brings me great joy to be here with you virtually to discuss successes, lessons, and challenges to combating poverty and inequalities. The timing really couldn't be more apt, with the dual health and economic crisis induced by COVID-19 and the looming climate catastrophe both posed to liquidate decades of progress in the fight against poverty and inequalities. These are indeed heartbreaking times. 6 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, we've lost over 1 million human lives. An estimated 400 million people, disproportionately women, have lost their jobs. Workers across the world have lost more than $3.5 trillion in income as a result of the pandemic, equaling over 10% of their already diminishing paychecks. Up to 500 million people could be pushed into poverty by the time the pandemic is over. And this virus feeds on divisions among us, exacerbating inequalities between men and women, between rich and poor, between the privileged and the forgotten. While workers, their families, and businesses are struggling to survive, some large corporations have either managed to shield themselves from the economic fallout of the pandemic or even cashed in on the disaster. We at Oxfam found that 32 of the world's top companies are together expected to make almost $110 billion more in profits during the pandemic than in previous already quite profitable years. Meanwhile, the 25 wealthiest billionaires increased their wealth by a staggering $255 billion between mid-March and late May this year alone. In response to the pandemic-induced economic freeze, governments have taken historic and I'd say quite necessary actions to extend economic lifelines to people. But these haven't come cheap. Public debt around the world is projected to reach the highest level in recorded history in relation to GDP, exceeding World War II levels of public indebtedness in both high, middle, and low-income countries. We're witnessing a level of pandemic-induced fiscal fragility that could provide a pretext for another tsunami of austerity measures, predictably producing harms to human rights which could outlast the pandemic itself. But this doesn't have to be the case if governments learn the lessons of the last crisis. So what can we learn from the last global economic crisis just over 10 years ago today? Over the past decade, previously with the Center for Economic and Social Rights and now with Oxfam, I've had the opportunity to collaborate with an extraordinary group of experts, activists, lawyers, and economists around the world who have come to the conclusion that we as the human rights community can no longer afford to neglect the material, fiscal foundation of rights. That is, every human right sanctified in the Universal Declaration and codified in treaties and constitutions are vulnerable if they're not supported by truly equitable, sustainable, and accountable tax and fiscal policies. Who finances government and how are foundational questions to the realization of human rights for all without discrimination. Drawing on these lessons, I want to leave you with 3 core messages today for this session. First, austerity is anathema to the realization of human rights and the struggle against the injustice of inequality. Not all fiscal contractions are inherently harmful. Governments expand and contract the level and type of public financing to manage constantly different climates. However, austerity measures put in place from 2010 to 2017, 2018 have been a fundamental driver in the erosion of basic human rights over the past decade. They've also prevented meaningful investments to drive future economic success. A thorough cross-jurisdictional investigation by CESR in 2018 found the following 4 ways in which austerity measures harm human rights. First, budget cuts to essential public services have directly weakened the rights to health, education, food, housing, water and sanitation, a healthy environment, access to justice, and the freedoms of information and expression. Second, regressive tax reforms have thwarted the equal right of everyone to an adequate standard of living, exacerbating economic, gender, ethnic, and other inequalities. Third, austerity-induced labor market reforms pose particular harm to human rights in the workplace. And fourth, pension reforms have too often infringed upon older persons' rights to Social Security, especially for older women. All in all, fiscal austerity has adversely affected a variety of human rights, not just economic and social, but political, social, civil, and environmental. Because of their disproportionate impact on already disadvantaged sectors of the population, unnecessary and unjust fiscal consolidation measures undermine the cross-cutting right to be free from discrimination on grounds such as gender, race, age, disability, migration status, and many more. Some would have you believe that fiscal prudence is an uncomfortable virtue and requires sacrifice. Yet too often over the past decade, the burden of that sacrifice has been borne by the least able to bear it, with those most able continuing to enjoy exorbitant privileges. What's more, recent empirical literature from the IMF and others concluded that fiscal contraction before recovery is counterproductive economically and merely prevents a full economic rebound. That's not what we want after this crisis. In this sense, austerity not only generates a scarcity of resources, unnecessarily so, it also recreates a sort of poverty of the imagination in what is possible. It's time to reimagine the future, starting with the austerity's alternative. That brings me to the second lesson. Human rights-aligned tax policy can be the lifeblood of a just and sustainable recovery and economy. The alternative to austerity, indeed, is a bold reawakening of tax as a central policy tool to both stabilize fiscal systems while reverting inequalities and rebuilding public trust, all of which are elements and foundations towards human rights fulfillment. So what does tax have to do with it? It's not a single silver bullet solution. The fact remains, though, that governments across the world, both individually and in concert, continue to underutilize taxation as a crucial tool to protect human rights, reverse inequalities, correct market abuses, and cement the bonds of accountability between the state and its people. Governments in all income categories consistently struggle to raise sufficient resources for human rights, leaving money on the table for no particular good reason. Low-income countries in particular face immense challenges to taxing multinational companies which operate in their jurisdictions. They are put at a detriment because higher-income countries, where these multinationals are headquartered, have so far failed to allow for a more democratic rewriting of the international tax rules to put an end to corporate tax abuse. In addition to leaving money on the table, governments also often rely on extremely inequitable tax policies to raise the revenue that does come in. These further exacerbate gender, ethnic, economic, and many other forms of inequality in our societies. And too often, the process of tax policy making suffers from a dearth of public participation, accountability, which could correct governments when they do wrong, but could also make for a more informed and future-looking tax policy in the future. So what would a bold reimagining of tax policy founded upon the principles of human rights and equality look like during and post this pandemic? This would very much depend on the country, but in general terms, I can point out the following factors. A strongly progressive personal and corporate income tax would raise sufficient revenue while tampering down extreme inequalities, both fundamental to human rights. A temporary COVID-19 pandemic profits tax or excess profit tax could help raise over $100 billion annually from just a small proportion of extremely profitable supersized companies. This could be pumped back into essential public services, which could then induce an economic recovery and create a more shared sacrifice. Similarly, it's a long time for a more effective wealth tax, which redeploys the billions sitting in the hands of a few lucky business owners into our public health, education, and social protection systems. And then finally, just a third lesson to preventing another lost decade. We're going to need you, the human rights protection regime, to step in. It's far time now that we see human rights values not merely as collateral damage or as casualties of economic policy, but actually as compasses, human rights principles and norms as a compass to help orient and guide tough dilemmas facing every tax and economic policymaker in every country. This is also to say that the pre-existing human rights norms, principles, and mechanisms can have an essential, hopeful, and proactive role to play in this fight for economic and tax justice. Applying existing norms and principles to changing conditions, human rights bodies around the world have already begun to rapidly retool themselves to become better watchdogs of harmful tax and fiscal policies. Whether you look at the international treaty bodies, UN Special Rapporteurs, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, various regional bodies, and even domestic courts, the human rights protection regime has made remarkable advances in investigating and looking for a remedy for adverse effects of tax abuse. The guiding principles for assessing the human rights impact of austerity and other economic reform policy developed by the UN Independent Expert on Debt and Human Rights provides a great example of many others. So to conclude, we face really unparalleled times. When we most need to stand united, it seems we remain increasingly divided. When we most need global leadership to stand firmly upon the premise that every human being has inherent dignity and equal rights, we see instead a retreat to hollow nationalism and self-defeating parochialism. Fixing the fiscal foundations for a just economic order, founded on human rights, will not solve every problem. But with your help, we can better align tax and fiscal policies with the norms and principles of human rights, opening the fiscal space to imagine a brighter, more just, and more sustainable future. I thank you.